Lord Peter did not linger in the chill of the churchyard longer than courtesy required. The widow, Mrs. Eleanor Gresham, had been escorted home, and the niece, Miss Clara Fairchild, a young woman with a jawline far too determined for one of her age, was fussing over her aunt as though her entire understanding of decorum depended upon keeping the elderly lady upright. Whimsy, content to let the household fuss, noted with detached amusement the precision with which the butler, a stout man named Henshaw, placed cushions and adjusted the folds of a cashmere throw. Every gesture, every inclination of the head spoke volumes about the household's unspoken hierarchies and about secrets they did not yet know they were betraying. He followed discreetly, giving the appearance of a passer-by while cataloguing the minutiae of domestic life. The slight misalignment of the hallway carpet, the faint scuff marks on the polished banister, the way Henshaw's eyes flicked ever so briefly toward the widow's boudoir before returning to Miss Fairchild's frantic ministrations. Each observation, trivial to the ordinary eye, formed threads in a tapestry that Whimsy would later unravel with merciless precision. "Your aunt seems remarkably composed now," he remarked, as though speaking only to himself, though Miss Fairchild looked up, startled, and blushed. One might almost forget the dramatic fainting at midnight. Curious, isn't it, that no one else suffered from heat or incense-induced malaise? I don't know, sir," stammered Clara, her voice trembling slightly. Perhaps she is just delicate." "Delicate?" Whimsy mused, tapping a gloved finger against his cheek. Yes, that might explain a touch of pallor, but not the peculiar firmness of her grip on the rosary just now. A truly fainting lady does not clutch her beads as if they were the last link to survival in a shipwreck. The household had gathered reluctantly in the drawing-room by now. Mrs. Gresham was seated upright in her favorite wing-back chair, looking both mildly affronted and faintly interested by the presence of the inquiring lord. Henshaw hovered discreetly near the doorway, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, fussed over the arrangement of teacups with that singular dedication that suggested she would sooner realign the constellations than permit a misaligned saucer. "I understand, my dear madam," Whimsy said, addressing Mrs. Gresham directly, "that your discomfort was entirely unexpected. I trust, however, that you recollect every detail of last night's service." The widow nodded, her lips pressed in a line of polite propriety. "Yes, Lord Peter, I remember everything. Though, naturally, one does not expect fainting at church. One hopes never to faint again." "Indeed," said Whimsy, tipping his head with an ironic air of sympathy. "Though one must sometimes hope precisely for the things that are improbable in order to test the mettle of one's constitution and one's acquaintances." He paused, allowing the words to settle over the assembled household. "Might I ask, then, about the moment immediately preceding your indisposition?" Clara hesitated. She was kneeling, sir, praying, and then she just lost herself, but it was so sudden." "Pray, we are not considering the sudden as a reliable witness," Whimsy observed with a faintly arch smile. "It has a disconcerting habit of being, by definition, inconclusive. Did anyone notice anything unusual? A sound, a smell, a movement?" The household exchanged glances. Henshaw coughed. Mrs. Fenwick looked mildly scandalized. "Nothing, my lord," she said firmly. "Nothing at all." Whimsy allowed a gentle pause. "Nothing at all," he repeated softly, as though testing the phrase against the echoes in his own mind. Then, as if in passing, he added, "And yet I detect a faint scent. Bitter almonds, is it not? That lingers even now." The room froze. A faint shiver passed through Mrs. Gresham, though she remained upright. Henshaw's lips pressed together in a thin line. Even the housekeeper paused, mid-arrangement of sugar tongs. "Almonds, sir?" Clara said cautiously. "Bitter almonds," Whimsy confirmed, inhaling subtly. "A curious and, I fear, unwholesome aroma. Naturally, it may have been the candles or an unfortunate coincidence. Yet coincidence, as we know, is rarely the final arbiter of truth. Mrs. Gresham coughed delicately, as if to remind all present of the fragility of appearances. "I assure you, Lord Peter," she said, "I do not understand you at all. Surely you overstate matters. I am merely an old woman who fainted, nothing more." "Ah," Whimsy said, leaning back slightly in his chair, a hand brushing ash from his cigar. "Yet it is precisely the overstatement, the exaggeration, the minor infraction of ordinary expectation that often reveals more than the plain statement of facts. I am fond of details, dear madam, the little things no one remembers, or thinks themselves too polite to note. And in their forgetting, one finds the skeletons of truths long hidden." He rose then, allowing a polite bow, and glanced around the room with a practiced sweep of observation. The drawing-room was orderly, too orderly, perhaps. The cushions were all aligned to the nearest millimetre. The fire had burned evenly overnight, and yet a single chair by the window was slightly askew, as if someone had moved it in haste or in distraction. "Tell me, Mrs. Gresham," he said gently, "who last approached this window before the service?" The question, innocuous on its face, produced a ripple of hesitation. Miss Clara faltered. I believe the gardener's boy, perhaps. He was bringing in some lilies for the altar." "Lilies," murmured Whimsy. "Ah, yes. Beautiful flowers, not infrequently, a source of mischief in a household attentive to appearances. One must always be mindful of the gardener. They see much, often more than one supposes." He allowed a pause, then added lightly, "And yet one hopes that no one would faint merely because of a flower. That, after all, would be too theatrical for even the most devoted parishioner." As the household processed these observations, Whimsy noted the smallest gestures: a finger tapping the arm of a chair, a flutter of eyes to the sideboard, a slight catch in Mrs. Gresham's breath. None of it overt, but each a thread he would, in due course, weave into a pattern no one suspected. For the first feint had been nothing if not deliberate, and in its subtlety lay the first whisper of an intricate, concealed intention. And as the evening drew on, with the widow resting and the niece fretting, Whimsy retired to the study, cigar smoke curling like a question mark in the dim light, thinking quietly. Some faintings are accidents, some performances, and a very few are invitations, to notice, to deduce, to see what others pretend not to see. And he had accepted that invitation with all the refined amusement of a man well practiced in the art of human folly. The following morning, the household at Gresham House was a study in muted anxiety. The fainting incident at St. Bartholomew's had, despite Mrs. Gresham's protests to the contrary, unsettled everyone. The widow herself moved with the careful deliberation of one aware that the eyes of a detective, albeit an unconventional one, were still upon her. Lord Peter Whimsy arrived shortly after breakfast, not with the brusque authority of a police inspector, but with the quiet, archly inquisitive air of a man who preferred observation to ostentation. Henshaw, the butler, opened the door with a rigid courtesy that barely concealed his unease. "Lord Peter," he said, voice steady but eyes betraying a flicker of apprehension. "Your presence is welcome, of course. I hope your night was agreeable." "Entirely," Whimsy replied lightly, stepping inside, his gaze sweeping over the polished floors and perfectly arranged furniture. "Though I confess I have been pondering the curious fainting of your mistress. One does not faint at a service without leaving some invisible trace, a footprint in the mind, if not upon the carpet. It is the traces one leaves behind that tell the story, Henshaw. And there are traces here, I am sure of it." Henshaw's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, leading the way into the drawing-room where Mrs. Gresham was seated once more, teacup in hand. She regarded Whimsy with polite wariness, as though she suspected that he could see things she had not yet imagined. "Good morning, madam," Whimsy said with his habitual arch inflection. "I trust your rest was sufficient. One must, of course, recover from the exertions of fainting." Mrs. Gresham inclined her head. I slept adequately, though, as you may imagine, Lord Peter, the incident was embarrassing. Embarrassing indeed, he agreed, settling into a chair across from her. And yet, embarrassment is often a poor companion to those who faint at precisely the wrong moment. Tell me, madam, have you noted anything unusual in the household of late? Visitors, letters, odd noises? The widow's gaze flickered briefly to Henshaw, whose expression was the perfect mask of loyal discretion. No, Lord Peter, nothing of consequence. The household has been quite ordinary. Ordinary, Whimsy repeated softly, as if testing the word against the resonance of reality. Ah, yes, ordinary is the word criminals hope we will believe, and yet ordinary often conceals the most extraordinary intentions. It was at that moment that a new figure appeared in the doorway, an abrupt intrusion upon the carefully arranged domestic tableau. Mr. Gerald Faraday, a distant cousin of Mrs. Gresham, swept into the room with the self-assurance of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an air of mild irritation as though the world had inconvenienced him by existing. "Peter!" he exclaimed, feigning surprise. "I had no idea you were in Malvern. I trust all is well with the family?" Merely recovering from a slight indisposition, Whimsy said dryly, allowing a small arch of his brow to register. "One might almost call it a fainting fit, though I observe that it was executed with remarkable precision." Faraday's eyes narrowed slightly, but he managed a thin smile. "Indeed. She is, as you know, prone to the occasional dramatic gesture, quite like her late husband in that respect." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Prone, you say? And yet last night's fainting occurred during a public service. Curious timing for one who is prone at home." He paused, letting the observation linger. "You were, I believe, absent from the service?" "I had business in London," Faraday replied smoothly, though there was the merest hesitation, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that Whimsy catalogued immediately. "A rather pressing matter. Nothing untoward, I assure you." "Of course," Whimsy said, puffing lightly on his cigar, "though it is extraordinary how pressing matters often coincide with the fainting of relatives. The coincidence, I assure you, is the most entertaining part of the day." Clara, hovering nervously, interjected. "Cousin Gerald has been very kind, Lord Peter. He only returned this morning." "Returned this morning," Whimsy repeated, nodding slowly. "So he was absent at the moment of the fainting. Intriguing, and yet one feels that Mr. Faraday's arrival adds a certain tension to the otherwise ordinary atmosphere." Henshaw shifted slightly, the faintest creak of a floorboard betraying his attention to the conversation. Whimsy's eyes flicked toward him, noting the minutiae of posture, glance, and hesitation. Each small movement was catalogued, filed, and waited for significance. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy said finally, leaning forward, "you would not, by any chance, have observed anything, small, trivial, seemingly irrelevant, on your journey this morning? Perhaps a misplaced parcel, an unusual visitor, a misaligned letter in the hall?" Faraday laughed lightly, though it lacked conviction. "Nothing of the sort, I assure you. Only the usual business and the usual domestic order." "Ah, yes," Whimsy murmured, "the usual domestic order. And yet I detect a minor disturbance in it." He allowed the words to hang. A chair slightly out of alignment, the faint scent of almonds in the air, and a momentary hesitation when certain questions are asked. Trivial, perhaps, but to a man trained in observation, these trivialities speak louder than proclamations of innocence. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed louder than usual. Whimsy, seated comfortably, allowed the silence to stretch. Each occupant of Gresham House was catalogued, weighed, and measured against the invisible standard of truth he had silently erected. One would faint, one would hesitate, one would overstate. The patterns were emerging, subtle yet distinct, like the first strokes of a painter sketching a hidden scene on canvas. And at that moment, though none present would have admitted it, the first suspect had arrived. Not with guilt in his hand, but with opportunity, motive, and the faintest crack in the armor of propriety. Gerald Faraday, for all his charm and polish, had drawn the eye of Lord Peter Wimsey, and in that quiet recognition lay the seed of suspicion that would grow, tendril by tendril, into revelation. The game had begun, and the faint trace of bitter almonds was only the first whisper of a truth yet to be fully uncovered. Wimsey rose from his chair and allowed his gaze to sweep across the drawing-room once more, lingering briefly on the familiar details he had catalogued the previous night. The slight misalignment of the chair near the window, the polished surface of the sideboard reflecting an almost imperceptible distortion in the light, and the quiet, almost invisible signs of nervous attention in the household. He had learned, over years of observation, that the trivialities of domestic life were the most reliable witnesses. A clock that ran fast by a few minutes, a servant's sudden interest in tidying, a door left ajar when no one should have entered. "Mr. Henshaw," he began casually, his voice deceptively gentle, "you have served this house long, I understand?" The butler inclined his head, tight-lipped. 15 years, my lord. I know the routines, the household, the habits of everyone here." "Ah," Wimsey said, tapping his chin lightly. 15 years' experience, and yet small changes are always so conspicuous to the practiced eye. One notices, for instance, whether a window has been opened or closed, the precise tilt of a lampshade, or the faint scent that might cling to a morning gown. Tell me, has anything been moved, altered, or otherwise amiss of late?" Henshaw's expression remained neutral, though the brief hesitation, the twitch of an eyebrow, did not escape Wimsey's notice. "Nothing of consequence, my lord. Everything is as it should be." "Of course," Wimsey replied, arching an eyebrow, "and yet one must be vigilant. Trivial alterations, I find, are their most eloquent betrayals. Consider the chair by the window, slightly out of alignment, I noticed. One wonders whether it was a simple oversight or a gesture made in haste, perhaps by a visitor unaccustomed to the strict proprieties of the household." Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper who had been arranging the teacups with the precision of a general marshalling troops, spoke up hesitantly. "That chair, it was Mr. Faraday, I think. He moved it yesterday evening. Said he wished to look out at the garden." Wimsey's eyes twinkled faintly. "Ah, indeed. One begins to build a pattern. A sudden fainting, a chair moved in secret, a visitor arriving in the precise interstice of opportunity. Fascinating, and yet still insufficient for certainty. One must continue to observe, to question, and, above all, to reconstruct the precise sequence of events." He rose and paced slowly across the carpet, allowing the household to absorb his presence as though he were some living embodiment of their collective conscience. His gaze rested on the mantel clock, whose hands were a minute fast. He tapped it lightly. Time, as always, is a reliable witness. Consider the moment of last night's fainting, the tolling of the church bells, the interval before your aunt was attended. Does it not strike one as unusual?" Clara frowned. "I suppose it did take some moments for her to be noticed. But it was dark, and the chapel was crowded." "Precisely," Wimsey said, smiling faintly. "Darkness and crowds, two perennial accomplices of concealment, and yet one must not ignore the small signs. The precise interval between bell and response, the gestures of the faithful, the subtle exchange of glances, all of it speaks, if one knows how to listen." Mrs. Gresham sipped her tea delicately, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Wimsey, noting the almost imperceptible tightness in her fingers around the cup, filed it away for future reference. Small physiological reactions were often far more telling than words. "Tell me," he continued, seating himself once more, "about the household routine during the day. Who tends the flowers in the chapel? Who attends to the candles? Who would have had access to the pew where your aunt was seated?" Clara spoke quickly. "The gardener's boy brought lilies, yes. But the candles, that is Father Dunlop's responsibility. And as for the pew, no one should approach it except for the verger or the clergy." "Ah, whimsy," murmured, tapping ash from his cigar. "Yet even the most rigid routines can be flexed. A slight lapse, an assumed permission, a visitor in haste, all possibilities that deserve contemplation." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then, in a tone that suggested casual interest rather than investigation, he added, "And the visitors themselves. Mr. Faraday has been in Malvern, yes? Present at any unusual hour, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "He returned yesterday morning, but he had been away for business, as he said." "Business, naturally," Whimsy said lightly, "though business often provides the perfect alibi. Absence at a critical moment, presence at a convenient interval. Timing, my dear Clara, is the soul of opportunity." Mrs. Gresham's hand trembled ever so slightly as she placed her cup down. Whimsy's eyes flicked toward her, noting the movement with the precision of a watchmaker. "One wonders," he said, "whether a fainting fit is ever entirely spontaneous, or whether it might be provoked, guided, rehearsed even. Not by mere accident, but by design. And if by design, one must consider what design, for whom, and most importantly, why?" The silence that followed was dense with unspoken anxiety. Even Henshaw, steadfast in his loyalty, seemed to sense that beneath the polite conversation lay currents he could neither name nor resist. Whimsy, observing the subtle tremors of conscience in those around him, smiled faintly to himself. He had begun to map the household, its patterns and fissures, its loyalties and hesitations. And in that quiet observation, the first threads of suspicion took shape. Not in the overt drama of accusation, but in the small, almost imperceptible deviations from ordinary life. The faint scent of almonds, the chair out of place, the hesitation of the butler, the timing of the cousin's arrival, all were puzzle pieces that would, in due course, assemble into a picture more vivid and disturbing than anyone yet suspected. Whimsy, reclining slightly in his chair, allowed himself a small, arch smile. The household thought him merely curious, perhaps eccentric. They had no idea how attentive he truly was, or how patiently he would wait, gathering the trivialities until the full truth emerged from the shadows. It was, as he well knew, only the beginning. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Gresham House, striking the parquet floor in narrow bands that shifted slowly as the day progressed. Whimsy, cigar smoke curling around his head like a question mark, had taken up a position near the fireplace, ostensibly to enjoy its warmth, though in reality he was surveying the household with the precision of a man calculating trajectories on a chessboard. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitation was noted, catalogued, and weighed against the others. Clara hovered nervously nearby, attempting to maintain conversation, yet betraying herself with a fidgeting hand or a sudden intake of breath whenever her cousin Gerald spoke. The young man, tall and immaculately composed, paced the length of the drawing-room, fingers occasionally brushing a chair back or the edge of a carpet. He was charming, polite, superficially generous, yet there was a tautness in his movements, a subtle insistence upon control that Whimsy did not fail to notice. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy began, his voice light yet precise, "you mentioned business in London. Pray, what kind of business takes precedence over family obligations, particularly when a relative might, shall we say, faint in public?" Faraday smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Merely financial matters, Lord Peter. Unavoidable engagements, I assure you." "Financial matters," Whimsy repeated softly. "Ah, yes. Financial matters often intersect most curiously with timing. One might almost suspect they dictate the comings and goings of relatives, though I would not dream of accusing anyone of such premeditation." Faraday's hands flexed minutely as he spoke, and Whimsy's gaze noted the movement, a detail easily missed by the inattentive eye, but one that hinted at inner agitation. The room seemed to contract subtly, as if the furniture itself were leaning toward him, eager to participate in his quiet scrutiny. "Tell me," Whimsy continued, moving toward the window where the chair had been adjusted the previous evening. "When you returned, did you notice anything out of place? A chair, a book, an object mislaid, perhaps, or a faint scent in the air that might strike one as unusual?" Clara flushed and glanced at her cousin. Faraday's smile tightened, polite but strained. "Nothing of note," he said. "The house appeared exactly as it should. You are far too attentive, Peter." "Ah," Whimsy said with the faintest lift of an eyebrow, "attentiveness is a quality I prize highly. One notices the incongruities, the subtleties, the gestures others deem too trivial to record. And it is in the trivial, my dear sir, that the truth often lurks." He lingered near the chair by the window, crouching slightly to observe the slight scuff on the parquet, invisible to anyone not specifically trained to notice. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself. "A mark, subtle yet telling. Someone has moved here recently. Not with malice, I think, but with purpose. One wonders at the intention." Mrs. Gresham shifted in her chair, a faint flush across her cheeks. Whimsy's gaze met hers, unyielding yet calm. "Madam," he said gently, "the fainting, the chair, the smell of almonds, these are threads of a fabric you may not yet have recognized. Threads that, when traced carefully, may lead to a pattern most revealing." Clara clasped her hands tightly. "You are reading too much into a small incident, Lord Peter. Surely it was only an accident." "Perhaps," Whimsy allowed, tapping ash from his cigar with meticulous care. "And yet accidents rarely repeat themselves with such precise timing. I'm reminded, madam, of a line from Horace. Nil admirari. One must marvel at nothing, yet notice everything. In noticing, we begin to understand. In understanding, we begin to perceive intention." Henshaw cleared his throat and stepped closer, clearing his throat again as though testing the air for a reaction. "If I may, my lord," he said carefully, "I noticed, last night, a visitor in the hall. Mr. Deverell, he called unexpectedly. I did not mention it, for it seemed trivial, and he departed almost at once." Whimsy's eyes sparkled. "A visitor, you say? Trivial, yes, but never too trivial for a man trained to detect the ripples of human behavior. Tell me everything, the time, the manner of his arrival, the length of his stay, the direction he took when leaving." Henshaw recited the details with precision. Deverell had arrived shortly after dinner, remained barely 10 minutes, and departed without entering the drawing-room, ostensibly to confer with the gardener. Whimsy noted, as he often did, the slight embellishments, the nuances of language that revealed more than the facts themselves. "Curious," he murmured, drawing a slow circle in the air with his cigar. "And yet this visit, brief as it was, coincides almost exactly with your aunt's fainting. Do you not see, madam? Coincidence is a curious companion, often mistaken for chance when it is merely waiting for scrutiny." Mrs. Gresham's lips pressed together tightly. Clara's hand trembled against the arm of her chair. Faraday, for his part, stiffened imperceptibly, the practiced ease of his manner faltering ever so slightly. Whimsy, seated once more, allowed his eyes to drift across the faces before him. Each expression, each hesitation, each minuscule twitch was recorded, catalogued, and measured against the emerging tapestry of timing, access, and subtle motive. And though no accusation had been made and no crime had yet been named, the household had shifted imperceptibly. The faint, precise disturbances, the chair, the scent, the visitor, were converging into a lattice of suspicion, and Lord Peter Whimsy, with his habitual arch amusement, was quietly pleased. The game was no longer merely observation. It was inquiry, and the first cracks in the facade of propriety were beginning to appear. He reclined once more, cigar in hand, eyes gleaming with the small, ironic satisfaction of a man who sees the world not as it appears, but as it might be if one simply knew where to look. And in that quiet, expectant pause, the seeds of revelation had already been sown, invisible to all but the keenest eye. Whimsy's attention, after a thoughtful puff on his cigar, shifted toward the minutiae of the room that most would have dismissed: the clock on the mantel, the slight unevenness of the curtains, the faint scuff marks near the hearth. To the untrained eye, these were mere domestic imperfections, but to him they were evidence, signposts of movement, attention, or neglect. "Mr. Henshaw," he said, allowing his tone to suggest casual curiosity rather than interrogation. "The mantel clock, it chimes the hour, yes? Precisely?" "Generally, my lord, yes, though it tends to run slightly fast, perhaps a minute or two over the course of the week." "A minute or two," Whimsy repeated, tapping ash into the tray with careful deliberation. "Fascinating. And the chime last night, were you within earshot at the time of the fainting incident?" Henshaw hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Yes, my lord. I heard the chimes. Nothing unusual, except that the sixth toll seemed slightly delayed. I thought nothing of it at the time." "Of course," Whimsy said lightly, leaning back in his chair. "But one must always consider what a minute's delay might conceal. Time is, after all, a most reliable witness, when it chooses to be observed carefully." He rose and moved toward the tall window, fingers brushing the edge of the curtain. "And these draperies," he said, noting the faintly uneven folds, "do they move freely on a morning breeze, or have they been recently adjusted?" Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, looked up sharply. "Adjusted, my lord? Only to keep the sunlight from fading the furniture. We are careful with the curtains here." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet there is a subtle asymmetry, is there not? A small, nearly imperceptible shift, as if someone has leaned against them or opened them in haste." He allowed the observation to hang in the air, watching as the household stiffened imperceptibly. He turned toward Faraday, whose composed posture had begun to falter under the quiet weight of attention. "And you, sir, did you by chance move these curtains yesterday, or perhaps approach this window for some reason?" Faraday's response was smooth, though the slightest catch in his breath betrayed a flicker of tension. "Merely to glance at the garden. I assure you, nothing of significance occurred." Whimsy allowed a small, ironic smile to touch his lips. "Of course, yet these trivial movements, the chair by the window, the curtains, the scuff on the parquet, seem, to my eye, to form a small choreography. One cannot help but wonder what dance they are performing and for whose benefit." He turned back toward the mantel clock. "And let us not forget the clock's delay. A single minute, yet it divides precisely the interval between the service's final toll and your aunt's fainting. Odd, is it not, that a coincidence should align so neatly with other irregularities?" Clara shifted nervously in her seat. I had not noticed the delay, Lord Peter. Surely it was trivial." "Trivial?" Whimsy echoed with gentle incredulity. "Oh no, my dear Miss Fairchild. Triviality is the refuge of those unwilling to confront the truth. One does not faint at a service without leaving footprints. Visible, invisible, olfactory, temporal. And when the footprints converge, one begins to trace the path of intention." He allowed his gaze to sweep the room once more. Henshaw's stance was alert, yet contained an almost imperceptible rigidity. Mrs. Fenwick's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a silver tray. Faraday's fingers drummed softly against the arm of his chair. Even Clara's composure showed microfractures, the tiniest signs of tension betrayed by a shift in posture, a twitch of the lip. "Now," Whimsy said, lowering himself back into the armchair, "let us consider access. Who might approach the pew where your aunt was seated without attracting attention? Clergy, verger, attendants, perhaps? He allowed the pause to stretch, letting the household fill it with unspoken possibilities. Or a visitor well acquainted with the layout of the chapel and the rhythms of its congregation. The words, though softly spoken, seemed to ripple through the room. Each person present processed them differently. A fleeting tightening of the jaw, a subtle shift in weight, a finger brushing a rosary bead with slightly too much force. Whimsy, cataloguing these micro-reactions, allowed himself the smallest of wry smiles. Observation, he murmured, almost to himself, is the gentle art of allowing others to reveal themselves through the ordinary, while convincing them that they conceal all. And so far, this household has proven most obliging. He leaned forward slightly, cigar balanced delicately between fingers. We have a faint, a scent, a displaced chair, curtains subtly shifted, a delayed clock, and a visitor whose return coincided with the precise hour of opportunity. Each on its own might be dismissed. Together, however, they suggest a small, deliberate orchestration, and orchestration, as we know, implies intention. A quiet settled over the room, thick and expectant. Even the distant ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to emphasize the weight of his words. No one spoke, no one moved. And in that stillness, Whimsy knew that the invisible threads of human behavior, timing, hesitation, movement, scent, were gradually being woven into a lattice that could not long remain concealed. For the first time, the household felt the subtle, chilling presence of an observer who saw all, questioned nothing directly, yet whose attention left no corner of domestic life untouched. And Lord Peter Whimsy, in the calm, measured way of one who plays a long game, allowed them to stew in their own complicity, real or imagined, while he quietly assembled the architecture of the truth. Late that afternoon, Whimsy excused himself for a solitary walk through the clipped gardens of Gresham House. The sun was low, casting long, precise shadows across the gravel paths, and the cool air carried faint traces of last night's incense and the lingering sweetness of lilies. He had no intention of leaving the grounds, yet walking alone allowed his mind to arrange events as though in a ledger: time, motion, opportunity, intention. Each step, deliberate and measured, mirrored the careful sequence he was reconstructing in his mind. Returning to the drawing room, he drew a small notebook from his coat pocket, making notes with the casual precision of a man who always seemed more preoccupied with his cigar than his observations. He began by confirming the timeline. The bell tolls, the interval before Mrs. Gresham was attended, the exact moment when Henshaw heard the faint scuffle of a chair being moved, Faraday's return, and the brief, almost imperceptible visit of Mr. Deverell. Each element fit together, almost, yet one piece remained slightly misaligned: the scent of bitter almonds. He considered it carefully. Cyanide, a faint, unmistakable trace. The question was not its presence, any chemist would confirm it, but its source, its timing, and its intended effect. A fainting caused by natural weakness would not leave such a signature. One needed only to correlate the scent with opportunity, access, and motive to see the outline of design. Opportunity, timing, subtlety, and a witness oblivious to her own betrayal. Whimsy murmured, almost to himself, as he watched the shadows lengthen across the floor. The pattern was emerging slowly, like the gradual revelation of a picture in a developing photograph. First the background, then the midground, and finally the sharpest, most telling details. He returned to the household, casually inquiring of Clara about her aunt's condition and the routine of the day. The girl's responses, measured and polite, were laced with small inconsistencies. She hesitated when asked precisely what time she had returned from the chapel to the house, and again when queried about who had been attending to her aunt during breakfast. Henshaw and Mrs. Fenwick both supplied answers that were consistent with themselves. Yet when compared to each other, the sequences of action revealed minute discrepancies. A few minutes here, a slightly different order there. Whimsy leaned back in his chair, listening to the rhythm of the household as though it were a symphony. Each deviation, no matter how trivial, was a note out of place, signaling intention or concealment. He did not confront anyone directly. That would be premature. Instead, he asked questions of seeming irrelevance, about which silver tray held the sugar, about which corridor the morning draughts preferred, about whether the clocks upstairs and downstairs struck in precise unison. Each answer allowed him to test the chronology. Some responses aligned perfectly, others, barely perceptibly, contradicted each other. The faint scent, the timing of Faraday's arrival, the subtle adjustments to furniture, the minor discrepancies in statements. They were all pieces of a puzzle he was assembling with quiet relish. By evening, he had reconstructed a plausible sequence. A careful administration of a substance to induce fainting, timed precisely to coincide with Faraday's absence and Deverell's brief visit, capitalizing on the natural rhythms of the household to avoid immediate detection. The coincidental events, the moved chair, the slight delay of the mantel clock's chime, the subtle shifts in curtains, were deliberate, minor obfuscations that would, to anyone else, appear trivial. To Whimsy, they were the scaffoldings of an orchestrated performance. He lit his cigar, watching the curling smoke as it drifted toward the ceiling. The pattern was nearly complete, yet one element remained uncertain. The motivation. Timing, access, method, all could be accounted for, but why orchestrate such a feint? What end did it serve, and whose hand had guided the performance? Whimsy's eyes, sharp and observant, swept over the assembled household again. Each person betrayed a subtle hint of discomfort, a small unconscious signal. The widow, composed as ever, seemed slightly too careful in her movements. Clara's gestures were slightly over-precise. Henshaw's posture had the tiniest trace of tension. Faraday's polished composure was marred by a flicker of restraint. He allowed himself a faint smile. The chronology had exposed inconsistencies. The micro-observations had revealed gestures of concealment. The next step, as always, would be to watch, to ask seemingly trivial questions, and to allow the inconsistencies to betray their origin. The truth was close, like a shadow moving at the corner of one's eye, and in its revelation would lie not only the answer to last night's fainting, but the subtle, psychological manipulations that orchestrated it. Whimsy exhaled a plume of smoke and murmured to himself, "Time and subtlety, my dear friends, are the perfect accomplices, and very soon they shall lead me to the designer of this performance." The following morning, Whimsy took the opportunity to examine the household from an angle that was as subtle as it was revealing: the servants' routine. He moved quietly through the corridors, observing with that arch, clinical amusement which had long distinguished him from ordinary visitors. Henshaw and Mrs. Fenwick conducted their duties with impeccable polish, yet the repetition of gestures, the precise way Henshaw polished the silver handles, the almost ritualistic dusting of the sideboard, betrayed the tension of minds overburdened with small anxieties. "Tell me," Whimsy asked Henshaw as they passed the kitchen doorway, "who normally arranges the pews in St. Bartholomew's Chapel?" "The verger and Father Dunlop, my lord," Henshaw replied, steady but wary, though occasionally the gardener's boy assists with flowers or small items. "Only with permission." "Permission," Whimsy repeated lightly, as if tasting the word. "Ah, yes, permission. And what, pray, might occur if a visitor were unconcerned with formalities?" Henshaw's eyes flickered momentarily. "One would hope nothing untoward, my lord." "Ah, one hopes," Whimsy murmured, smiling faintly, though hopes rarely substitute for observation. He wandered on, noting the slight misalignment of a cupboard door, the faint scratch on the hallway floor near the sideboard. the way a small chair was slightly askew in the servants' hall. Each trace was minute, yet cumulatively significant, like the first threads of a tapestry, revealing an outline before the final image emerged. By late morning, he returned to the drawing-room where the household had convened in an air of polite vigilance. Mrs. Gresham was seated with her habitual composure, though the tautness in her shoulders suggested sleepless hours. Clara, pale and anxious, fidgeted with the fringe of her shawl. Faraday lounged near the fireplace, his movements fluid, controlled, but every so often, a subtle hitch betrayed restraint over irritation. Whimsy seated himself in a low chair, letting his gaze rove with deliberate detachment. One begins to understand the choreography of events by examining the peripheral movements, he said softly. The servants' routine, the alignment of chairs, the slight hesitations of those present, all a part of a subtle script enacted to conceal intention. He leaned forward, fixing Faraday with a polite, unwavering stare. "Consider your return yesterday, sir. You were absent at the moment of the fainting, yet present at a crucial juncture, allowing observation without interference. A convenient window, would you not agree?" Faraday's lips pressed into a tight line, his usual fluidity of manner faltering. "Convenient, yes," he said carefully, "but entirely coincidental. I assure you, Lord Peter, I had no part in—" "Coincidence," Whimsy interrupted gently, "is a most dangerous ally, particularly when combined with deliberate gestures. The chair by the window, the slight delay of the clock, the faint scent of almonds that lingers beyond the moment of administration. One must, I think, examine the question of motive, for opportunity alone is insufficient." Clara's voice trembled slightly. "Motive? What motive could there be?" Whimsy smiled faintly, as though offering a gift of insight without revealing it. "Ah, my dear, motive is the shadow behind action, often unacknowledged even by the actor. Wealth, jealousy, fear, ambition, these are the usual instruments. But subtlety, psychological manipulation, desire to influence the perception of others, these are far more elegant and far more dangerous." He rose and began to pace slowly near the windows, eyes narrowing on the faint marks in the parquet. "I have observed," he said, "that the administration of a substance, timed with precision, requires knowledge of both the environment and the behavior of others. One must know the exact interval between bells, the approximate location of witnesses, the sequence of gestures, the minor delays of servants. And yet," he added lightly, "this requires more than calculation. It requires an understanding of human nature, its weaknesses, and its predictable habits." He allowed the words to linger. Even the tick of the grandfather clock seemed to pause in acknowledgement. And so, one begins to see the outline of a second life, a hidden layer behind the ordinary. A relative, a visitor, a servant, anyone may conceal duality, and in concealment lay a trap. Whimsy turned, letting his gaze sweep the room once more. "We have the fainting, the scent, the chair, the curtains, the clock. We have opportunity and hints of motive. But what of intent? What of the psychological design that orchestrates these trivialities into a coherent, persuasive illusion?" Mrs. Gresham's hand trembled as she raised her teacup. Clara clutched the edge of the armchair, while Faraday's fingers tapped lightly, almost imperceptibly against the arm. Whimsy catalogued each micro-reaction with the precision of a mathematician. The narrowing of an eye, a faint tightening of the jaw, the subtle tilt of the head. Each was a variable in a puzzle slowly taking shape. He sank back into the chair, letting the weight of observation settle over the room. The double life is rarely dramatic. It is composed of minutiae, half-forgotten gestures, tiny discrepancies, and when all these converge, the design becomes apparent, though often it is not the hand one suspects, but the mind one underestimates. For a moment, the household was silent, as if the words themselves had drawn a curtain over ordinary speech. And Whimsy, in the calm satisfaction of patient inquiry, knew that he had begun to see beyond the surface of fainting and coincidence into the architecture of subtle intention. The stage was nearly set, and the actors, whether aware or not, were already playing their parts. As the afternoon waned, a subtle change seemed to settle over Gresham House. The sunlight, now filtered through the tall windows, cast long, slanting shadows that moved imperceptibly across the walls and floorboards. Whimsy, reclining lightly in a chair near the fireplace, allowed his eyes to drift over the room, cataloguing the minutiae as though each detail were a note in an elaborate symphony. It was then that his attention returned, almost by chance, to a seemingly trivial detail from the night of the fainting. The small window at the side of the drawing room, long since forgotten in conversation, was slightly ajar. Not enough to cause a draught or disturb the room appreciably, but enough, in Whimsy's exacting mind, to alter the calculus of events. He rose and moved deliberately to the window, running a gloved hand along the edge of the frame. The catch was untouched. The pane had been opened and left in its current position. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself. "A trivial gap, yet one which introduces variables previously unconsidered. Timing, position, access." He stepped back and surveyed the assembled household. Mrs. Gresham's gaze followed his movements with faint apprehension. Clara's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Faraday's expression remained polite but watchful, and Henshaw stood rigid, face impassive yet tense. Whimsy allowed a small, arch smile. Even the smallest detail, when considered within the broader pattern, could be a thread that unraveled an otherwise seamless tapestry of alibi and appearance. "Tell me," he said, turning to Henshaw, "who has routine access to this side of the room? Who would be familiar enough to manipulate a window without drawing notice?" "The verger, my lord," Henshaw replied after a brief pause. "And, of course, anyone who moves freely about the house. Visitors known to the family, such as Mr. Faraday." Whimsy allowed the pause to stretch, his eyes resting briefly on Faraday. "Indeed. And yet one must consider more than mere access. One must consider intent, timing, and the subtle manipulation of circumstance. A window left ajar may be entirely innocent, or it may be the final piece in a carefully constructed illusion." He returned to his chair, leaning back with his cigar balanced idly between his fingers. "And there is another observation, quite small yet significant. The placement of objects within the room. A salver slightly displaced, a chair nudged, a bell cord twisted in the direction of the door. All these serve as silent witnesses to movement, to presence, to action unseen." Mrs. Fenwick, who had been standing quietly at the periphery, swallowed audibly. Whimsy's gaze met hers, noting the subtle contraction of her pupils and the tiny, involuntary tightening of her hands around the tray she held. "Yes, my lord," she said softly. "I did notice some changes. Slight. I thought them unimportant at the time." "Ah," Whimsy murmured. "And yet slight is the very measure of subtlety. When orchestrated, it becomes deliberate. When deliberate, it becomes telling. Consider, too, the faint scent that has lingered, the almonds, that delicate hint. The combination of time, access, and chemical effect forms a chain, and each link is a clue." He paused, allowing the observation to settle. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed louder, each measured beat a metronome to the rhythm of his thoughts. The fainting was not spontaneous. The movements of objects, the subtle gaps in routine, the precise delay in the clock, and the scent, these together indicate planning. They suggest a hand invisible, yet guided, a mind orchestrating perception as much as action. Clara shifted in her seat, her voice trembling slightly. "But who could have done such a thing? Surely no one here would—" Whimsy's eyes, calm and archly amused, rested on her. "Ah, my dear, do not dismiss the potential for hidden layers. The double life, the secret purpose. the unacknowledged motives. These are rarely apparent until the cumulative effect of observation and deduction brings them into focus. And when the trivial becomes deliberate, even the most ordinary household harbors shadows. Faraday's hand brushed the arm of his chair, fingers tightening minutely. Whimsy noted the gesture with the same precision as a chemist noting a reaction. Shadows, he repeated softly, and the faint outlines of intention are often betrayed by the smallest of movements, the subtlest of gestures. One need only follow them. He leaned forward slightly, cigar in hand, eyes sweeping over the four figures present. The next step, naturally, will be to test the chronology, to match scent to moment, movement to opportunity, and timing to intention. For in the precise reconstruction of events, one finds the narrative that no witness dares to confess, yet all inadvertently reveal. A quiet fell over the room. The household, though outwardly composed, was now conscious of the weight of unseen scrutiny. And Lord Peter Whimsy, with arch detachment and that slight, almost imperceptible curl of the lip, knew that the invisible threads of conspiracy, or accident, or both, were beginning to converge. The faint, deliberate details, the overlooked movements, the minor discrepancies, they were all aligning toward a revelation that, when fully assembled, would leave no shadow unilluminated. That evening, the household of Gresham House settled into a tense, almost ritualized quiet. The last of the servants had retired to the servants' quarters, leaving the drawing-room and corridors to the soft echoes of a ticking clock and the occasional whisper of the wind against the tall windows. Whimsy, reclining lightly in his chair, allowed the shadowed corners to sharpen in his mind as though the dim light itself were illuminating possibilities previously overlooked. He began, in his usual archly deliberate way, to test the chronology of events with a precision that approached obsession. He recalled the tolling of the church bells, the interval between the 6th chime and Mrs. Gresham's fainting, the exact time Faraday had returned to the house, and the fleeting visit of Deverell. Each moment was noted in his small notebook, every tick of the grandfather clock reconciled against recollections and statements provided throughout the day. "What is fascinating," Whimsy murmured to himself, cigar smoke curling around his head, "is how small temporal discrepancies can so easily obscure the design of intention. A minute here, 2 minutes there, and suddenly opportunity is misrepresented, an alibi becomes convincing." He stood and moved toward the window, noting the faintly ajar pane once more. He tapped the latch lightly, the click echoing in the stillness. And here, he mused, the subtle intervention, no force used, merely timing and slight manipulation. A small act, yet it introduces variables, airflow, odor, dispersion, the passage of sound, that are significant only to those who observe closely. Henshaw entered at that precise moment, carrying a tray with the household's evening tea. His expression was neutral, yet Whimsy noted the slight hitch in his step, the barely perceptible stiffening of shoulders. "Ah, Henshaw," he said, archly. "Tell me again, who moved the chair by the window last night? You mentioned Mr. Faraday, did you not?" Henshaw's lips pressed together. "Yes, my lord. He adjusted it slightly to observe the garden. Nothing more." "Indeed," Whimsy said, letting the word linger. "Yet even slight adjustments have consequences. One never knows who observes them, or what they reveal when viewed in conjunction with other minor alterations. A tray misplaced, a curtain shifted, a salver left out of position." He poured himself a cup of tea, observing the way the light caught the liquid, the faint trembling of steam rising. And now one tests the sequence. The fainting, the visitor's brief appearance, the return of Mr. Faraday, the scent that lingered. Each element must be plotted against the others, with exact intervals and positions accounted for. Clara, who had been hovering near the doorway, stepped forward hesitantly. "Lord Peter, are you suggesting that someone planned it? The fainting, I mean." Whimsy's eyes, calm yet penetrating, met hers. Planned, orchestrated, subtle, words fail to capture the nuance. But yes, my dear, one observes the architecture of action, and in that architecture, one sees design. A fainting is rarely spontaneous when circumstances and minor details converge with such curious precision. He moved to the fireplace, leaning lightly against the mantel. Now consider the paradox. Opportunity alone does not suffice. One must have motive, knowledge of behavior, and, most importantly, an understanding of human perception. To orchestrate a minor incident unnoticed, one must be intimately familiar with the ordinary, and yet capable of guiding events just enough to produce an extraordinary outcome. He allowed the pause to settle over the room, filled with shadows that now seemed almost to quiver under the weight of implication. And in this, my dear observers, he added, voice soft yet precise, one begins to glimpse the double life, the hidden pattern, the psychological architecture behind what seems trivial. The fainting was a stage, the minor shifts props, the clock and window collaborators in silence. And it is here, in the interstices of ordinary life, that intention makes itself manifest. Even the distant ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to underscore his point. The household, though outwardly calm, felt the pressure of his observation. Faraday's composure was subtly taut, Clara's anxiety barely contained, and Mrs. Gresham's hands, resting on her lap, betrayed a faint tremor. Whimsy, with the slightest arch of his eyebrow, murmured, almost to himself, one must now follow the minutiae to their ultimate conclusion. Observe, question, reconcile. Let the chronology be tested, the contradictions exposed, and the subtle orchestration revealed. For in the precise alignment of opportunity, movement, and psychological intent lies the path to understanding. He sipped his tea with deliberate calm, eyes sweeping over the room as though already seeing the invisible lines connecting action and consequence, observer to observed, and incident to design. The threads were nearly aligned. The stage was set. The revelation, quiet yet inescapable, awaited only the final calculation of subtle facts. The following morning, a damp mist clung to the gardens of Gresham House, curling around the clipped hedges and rose bushes in a manner that seemed almost conspiratorial. Whimsy, hat perched at a rakish angle and gloves in hand, walked slowly through the corridors, eyes alert to the faintest irregularities in the familiar domestic order. Each step, each measured pause, was part of an invisible survey, an exercise in tracing minute variations that had, over the previous day, begun to reveal a lattice of subtle deception. He returned to the drawing-room where the household had gathered in that peculiar, anticipatory silence which accompanies an observer whose attention is both calm and inexorably acute. The air seemed slightly heavier, charged with the tension of unspoken observation. Whimsy settled into a chair near the fireplace, his gaze sweeping over each person with that faint arch of amusement that masked a precise, analytical scrutiny. "Let us reconsider," he began, voice soft yet incisive, "some of the seemingly trivial details of last night's events. A window left ajar, a chair slightly displaced, the faint scent that lingered in the air. Each element, viewed alone, appears inconsequential. Together, they form a network of minor irregularities, a choreography, if you will, which cannot easily be dismissed." He rose and moved to the sideboard, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of a silver salver, noting a faint displacement. "And here, for example, is a small object moved, not with violence, but with intent. Who touched it? When? And to what purpose?" Clara, seated with her hands clasped, glanced nervously at her cousin, Faraday, who maintained an outward composure that was now, in Whimsy's eyes, subtly taut. Mrs. Gresham sat with an expression of courteous concern, yet her fingers, resting upon the arm of her chair, betrayed a faint, rhythmic tension. Henshaw, standing at attention, avoided all eye contact, his silence punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of feet. "One must," Whimsy continued, pacing slowly, "reconstruct the exact chronology. The tolling of the church bells, the interval until Mrs. Gresham's fainting, the movement of chairs and curtains, the brief visit of Mr. Deverell and the return of Mr. Faraday. All these moments, measured and compared, reveal slight discrepancies in the accounts offered." He paused, letting his eyes rest briefly on Faraday. "Consider the scent of almonds. It is not merely coincidental. A fainting, natural or accidental, would leave no trace of chemical indication, and yet here it is, subtle, transient, yet unmistakable to a trained observer. The combination of opportunity, access, and psychological understanding suggests deliberate orchestration." Mrs. Gresham cleared her throat softly. "Lord Peter, are you suggesting that someone in this house deliberately caused it?" Whimsy inclined his head archly. "I suggest only that the evidence, minor though it may appear, points toward intervention, not necessarily with malice, but with intention. One must follow the chronology, reconcile the gestures, and observe the subtle manipulations that the ordinary eye dismisses as coincidence." He moved toward the window once more, noting the ajar pane, the faint drag of the curtain, the scuff on the parquet below. "Here, the sequence can be traced precisely. Each act, each micro-adjustment, marks the invisible hand of design. And when viewed in concert with the human behaviors, the micro-expressions, the gestures of hesitation, the slight tightening of posture, one begins to perceive a hidden layer, a double life perhaps, that animates the ordinary into something more deliberate." Faraday shifted in his chair, fingers brushing the armrest with a subtle, uncharacteristic tension. Whimsy's gaze followed the motion, cataloguing the anomaly with the precision of a mathematician noting a deviation in a formula. Clara's eyes were wide, the smallest quiver of lips betraying her inner apprehension. Even Henshaw, impassive as always, exhibited a slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted the silver tray beside the fireplace. "And so," Whimsy said, reclining once more, cigar balanced lightly between fingers, "one observes, reconstructs, and tests. The chronology reveals the intervals in which a subtle influence might be exerted. The gestures show which intentions were masked, and the objects themselves, slightly displaced, deliberately handled, confirm the hand behind the apparent chaos. It is in these interstices of ordinary life that design becomes legible." He allowed a slow, arch smile to touch his lips. "And once design is revealed, one can follow it, step by step, from action to actor, from intention to effect. The house itself, if one knows how to read it, becomes an open book." The room was quiet, the tension palpable. Each member of the household, though outwardly composed, had become part of the narrative Whimsy was reconstructing with effortless precision. And he, in the calm certainty of observation, had already begun to trace the invisible threads that would lead inevitably to the revelation of both motive and manipulator. The stage was set, the actors were unknowingly in position, and the first true unraveling of carefully staged events was about to begin. By late afternoon, Whimsy had resolved to test the patterns he had observed against the recollections and statements of those present. The drawing-room, now emptied of servants, held a hushed expectancy, as though the very furniture had become aware of its role in the subtle drama. He moved with his usual quiet precision, gesturing casually to a chair, tapping a finger on a corner of the carpet, noting the faint drag of the curtains once more. "Let us examine the sequence of events," he said lightly, eyes glinting with an arch amusement. "One may begin with the tolling of the church bell. Miss Fairchild, you returned from the service promptly, did you not?" Clara nodded, though her fingers fidgeted with the fringe of her shawl. "Yes, Lord Peter, immediately after the final bell." "And yet," Whimsy continued, pacing slowly, The fainting occurred not the instant of arrival, but what, some minutes later? Just a few, my lord, she admitted. Precisely, Whimsy said, tapping a finger against the mantel. And during those minutes, Mr. Faraday was absent, yes? Faraday, still near the fireplace, inclined his head smoothly. I had returned only briefly, Lord Peter. I did not foresee any incident. Ah, Whimsy murmured. Not foreseen, naturally. Yet opportunity, timing, and the slight disturbances of objects are rarely coincidental. The chair moved, the curtain drawn, the window ajar, the salver displaced. Each triviality in itself meaningless, but combined. He let the phrase hang, the implication settling like a fine dust over the room. He drew closer to the sideboard and picked up a small tray, turning it slightly in his hands. And here is the most subtle yet telling mark, a slight scratch, almost imperceptible, and yet sufficient to indicate handling. One may ask, who had reason, motive, and opportunity to touch this? Mrs. Gresham's hands tightened slightly. It is impossible to say, Lord Peter. We are a careful household. Indeed, Whimsy replied with gentle irony. Careful yet flawed, as all human arrangements are. And it is in these imperfections that intention leaves its mark. Micro-gestures, slight displacements, fractional delays, these are the signature of orchestration. He returned to his chair, allowing the weight of his gaze to encompass all four figures before him. Now, consider the timing of the fainting relative to Mr. Deverell's brief visit. Coincidence, surely. Henshaw shifted slightly. He arrived only briefly, my lord, and left almost immediately. Precisely, Whimsy said, his voice almost musical in its cadence. And yet, when aligned with the minor delays of clocks, the subtle adjustments of furniture, and the intervals of human movement, one begins to see a deliberate design. Clara's voice trembled. But who would have wanted to cause it? Whimsy's smile was faint, dry, and knowing. Ah, my dear, motive is a shadow lurking behind action, not always obvious, rarely confessed, and often disguised beneath the very politeness one presumes to be natural. Ambition, jealousy, subtle influence over perception, these are far more compelling than overt malice. And the evidence suggests, though does not yet declare, that someone in this household has orchestrated perception with skill. He leaned forward slightly, cigar balanced between fingers, eyes sweeping the room with analytical calm. Now the final test. Recollections compared with tangible evidence, minute discrepancies, faint traces, the scent, the timing of visitors, the position of objects. When all are reconciled, one discovers not merely who acted, but why and how. And it is here, in the interplay of psychology, timing, and minor but deliberate gestures, that the true pattern emerges. A subtle shiver of awareness passed through the household. Faraday's hand tapped lightly, almost involuntarily, against the armrest. Clara's eyes shifted nervously. Henshaw's posture became rigid. Mrs. Gresham's fingers trembled faintly. All micro-signals, unnoticed by ordinary observers, were catalogued with quiet precision in Whimsy's mind. And so, he said softly, almost conversationally, the stage is prepared, the pieces are in place. A minor disruption becomes a deliberate statement, a fainting becomes a clue, and the ordinary reveals the extraordinary. The question, of course, is which mind orchestrated these subtleties and why. That, dear friends, is the final act awaiting revelation. He leaned back, cigar smoke curling in the late afternoon light, allowing the suspense to settle. Each member of the household sat quietly, unknowingly poised at the edge of exposure. Whimsy, serene yet vigilant, knew the moment of unmasking was approaching, and that the smallest detail, a movement, a gesture, a scent, would soon bring the carefully hidden truth to the surface. That evening, with the house quiet and the servants retired, Whimsy rose from his chair and moved deliberately to the center of the drawing room, letting his gaze sweep over the assembled household. The shadows of the tall windows stretched across the floor, intersecting with the subtle scuffs, displaced chairs, and ajar window that had already formed the lattice of his observations. "Let us reconstruct the evening in precise sequence," he began, voice calm, arch, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. The church bells tolled as usual. "Miss Fairchild, you returned promptly, yes?" Clara inclined her head. "Yes, Lord Peter." "Yet the fainting occurred after some interval," Wimsey continued, "an interval during which minor adjustments took place. A chair moved, a curtain shifted, a salver displaced. Mr. Henshaw, you noted the brief presence of Mr. Deverell." "Yes, my lord. He was in the room for a few moments only." "And Mr. Faraday," Wimsey said, softly, his eyes resting on the otherwise composed figure. "You returned after the service, absent at the critical juncture. Opportunity, of course, is rarely proof of intention. Yet when aligned with the minor disruptions, the window ajar, the chair, the curtain, the salver, it suggests a subtle orchestration." He moved to the sideboard and lightly lifted the displaced salver, tilting it to reflect the faint light. "Observe. No violent handling, no overt signs. Yet the scratch upon the surface, the slight displacement, indicate attention and care. All very minor, yet cumulatively deliberate. And what is orchestrated with precision, even in the smallest details, may reveal the hand behind the act." Clara's voice trembled. "But why? Surely no one here intended harm?" Wimsey's lips curved faintly in ironic amusement. "Ah, my dear, intention need not be malicious to be revealing. Control, influence over perception, subtle manipulation. These are motives no less potent than anger or avarice. And the faint scent, the minor adjustments, the precise timing, they are all elements of a psychological design intended to influence, to test, to manipulate." He turned to Faraday, whose fingers now tapped nervously on the arm of the chair. "Let us consider, sir, your movements. You returned when Miss Fairchild was unattended, observed without interference, and left without notice. The timing aligns with a small window, literally and figuratively, during which subtle action could be taken unnoticed. The administration of a faint-inducing substance, if one were so inclined, would require precisely such conditions." Faraday's composure faltered ever so slightly. "I assure you, Lord Peter." "Assurance," Wimsey said softly, "is merely one layer of the performance. Let us examine the evidence. The fainting, the scent, the displaced furniture, the ajar window, the minor delays in clock chimes, the sequence of arrivals and departures. All of these, plotted together, indicate a deliberate act, guided by knowledge of the household and its routines, and executed with subtlety." He stepped back, letting the full weight of his reconstruction settle over the room. "Now, observe the culmination. The fainting, though appearing spontaneous, was timed to coincide with the visitor's absence. Minor adjustments of objects, slight deviations in furniture placement, and a delicate administration of substance combine to create an illusion of chance. Yet chance has no signature. Design does. And it is the signature that reveals the architect." Mrs. Gresham's fingers tightened on the armrest. Clara's lips quivered, Henshaw's posture became taut, and Faraday's eyes flickered with the faintest hesitation. Wimsey catalogued each reaction with the meticulous care of a surgeon noting subtle symptoms. "One must also consider psychological motive," he said quietly. "Not merely opportunity, not merely access, but knowledge of behavior, anticipation of routine, and an understanding of perception. The fainting was a stage, the minor movements props, and the reactions of others part of the performance itself. The actor, however, believed the stage empty of observation, yet here I stand." He allowed the pause to linger, the silence punctuated only by the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. "And so, the design is laid bare. The actor, working within familiar spaces, using knowledge of sequence and human behavior, orchestrated events to produce a precise, if minor, effect. One observes, records, and then traces the subtle fingerprints of intention left behind in furniture, air, and scent. Finally, with the faintest arch of his eyebrow, Whimsy smiled. The revelation, my dear friends, is not merely who acted, but why. For in the minute manipulations of time, space, and human expectation, one finds both the hand and the mind, the orchestrator of perception. And in such orchestration, even the smallest discrepancy becomes a key. He sank into his chair, the faint curl of a wry smile playing about his lips. The household, collectively tense and silent, felt the invisible net of deduction tighten and knew, though none could yet articulate, that the truth, subtle yet inexorable, had already been revealed. The room was silent, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Each measured beat a metronome to the rhythm of revelation. Whimsy rose, moving slowly to the center, cigar balanced lightly between fingers, eyes sweeping the assembled household with that faint, arch amusement that concealed the precision of his intellect. "Let us review the evidence, step by step," he said, voice calm yet carrying the authority of certainty. "We have the fainting at a precise interval after the service, the minor displacement of the chair, the ajar window, the subtle adjustments of the salver, and the faint scent of almonds lingering in the air. Each of these is trivial in isolation, yet when taken together, they form a coherent pattern, a choreography of intention designed to manipulate perception." He allowed his gaze to settle on Faraday, whose polished composure had been steadily fraying beneath the surface. Opportunity, access, knowledge of household routines, and careful timing, these are prerequisites. You, sir, returned at the critical moment, observing without interference. A feint, administered with subtlety, achieves its effect only when precisely calculated. Faraday's lips parted, an instinctive denial ready on his tongue, yet Whimsy's next words forestalled it. "And here, sir, is the final piece, the double life carefully concealed. The visit to the chemist, the purchase of innocuous-looking substances, the meticulous attention to minute details of timing and movement, each act deliberate, intended to create the illusion of chance." Mrs. Gresham gasped softly. Clara's eyes widened, hands twisting nervously in her lap. Henshaw remained rigid, but the faintest contraction of his jaw betrayed awareness. Whimsy continued, his tone mild, almost conversational. "The feint was not intended to harm, but to test, to influence, to manipulate perception. A psychological design, not one of malice. Yet design implies deliberation, and deliberation points to an author." He leaned forward slightly, the subtle curl of his lips a trace of amusement. "And that author, my dear friends, is none other than Mr. Faraday, not by whim or impulse, but by calculated, precise orchestration. The minor disruptions, the temporal adjustments, the subtle administration of a feint-inducing substance, all speak to his hand." Faraday's composure finally broke. A faint flush rose to his cheeks. His voice, when it came, was measured but thin. I did not intend harm, only curiosity, to see whether perception could be guided, whether the household could be influenced, even subtly." Whimsy inclined his head lightly. "Curiosity, indeed. Yet the orchestration itself is sufficient to reveal the actor. The stage is set, the props arranged, and the audience, though unknowing, becomes part of the demonstration. Your experiment, sir, was neither cruel nor careless, but deliberate, and deliberate acts leave traces." He allowed a brief pause, letting the implication settle. Observation, timing, minor gestures, and psychological insight have revealed the truth. The minor discrepancies in recollection, the displacement of furniture, the ajar window, and even the faintest scent all align with your actions. Nothing remains ambiguous. Nothing. Faraday lowered his gaze, the first true admission of guilt forming in the subtle tension of his shoulders. Yes, it was I. I wished only to observe, to understand. Whimsy's smile was arch, almost indulgent. And you have been observed in turn, sir. Let this serve as both lesson and reminder. In orchestrating perception, one may underestimate the acuity of those who watch quietly and carefully. The smallest detail betrays the greatest design. Turning to the assembled household, Whimsy's tone softened but retained its characteristic irony. We all walk among subtle arrangements, minor manipulations, and small theatricalities. Yet, when one aligns them with opportunity and intent, the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and even the most carefully hidden acts may be revealed by patience, observation, and the persistent scrutiny of detail. He straightened, pocketing his notebook with a faint flourish. And now, dear friends, the household may return to its ordinary rhythms. But remember, the house has been read, its stories unfolded, and the stage, subtle though it may have been, has revealed its performer. With that, Lord Peter Wimsey inclined his head with the faintest arch of amusement, tapped the ash from his cigar, and strolled calmly toward the door. The household, still processing the quiet unveiling, remained silent. As the door closed behind him, the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, the ordinary order of Gresham House restored, yet forever marked by the invisible hand that had revealed the extraordinary within the mundane. Outside, the evening air was cool and still. Whimsy paused briefly, glancing back at the house with a faint smile. Ah, the delicate architecture of human intention, he murmured softly. So easily disguised, yet always legible to those who observe carefully enough. And with that, he vanished into the twilight, leaving behind the echoes of revelation, quiet triumph, and the inevitable ripple of reflection that only a perfectly executed investigation can inspire. The mystery was resolved, the psychology understood, and the household, though chastened, had been illuminated by the gentle but unerring precision of Lord Peter Wimsey.